Hi, welcome again. In this lesson, we will see how to push our local repository to our remote repository. In our case, the remote repository we have created in the previous lesson. That is Git training version 1. Before we push our local repository to our remote repository, let us check the status of our local repository using the command git status. And also the git log history using git log one line. Here we can see total 3 commits at this point of timeline. Now it is our time to push our local repository to our remote repository. For that, we need to connect our local repository to GitHub server first. So, to connect our local repository to GitHub, we need to use the command git remote add origin and then the HTTPS link of the remote repository. Here is the HTTPS link of our remote repository we have created in the previous lesson. Let us copy it to the clipboard and paste it here. If there is no error, means we have successfully connected our local repository to our remote repository. Now, in order to push our local repository contents to the remote repository we just connected, we need to use the command git push origin main, because the default branch in the remote repository is main. For the first time, it will ask us to sign into our remote repository either through the personal access token or with the browser. Let us sign in with the browser. It will open a new window in our browser and ask us to authenticate and verify our credentials. So here we are giving a permission for Git credential manager, gisters, repositories, and workflow. So let us authorize. We are required to enter our password of the remote repository and then confirm the password. Once we confirm with the password, our local repository will be pushed to the remote repository. Now, if we check our remote repository by refreshing, we will see that the local repository has been pushed to the remote repository, and we can see the exact files which are in our local repository in remote repository as well. And also, if we click on the branches, we can see the main is the default branch in our remote repository. And currently we have one branch in the remote repository as well as in our local repository. Here we can see the number of commits, 3 commits, and the recent commit. Prepare the .gitignore file. If we click on the number of commits, we can see the commits made from our local repository and also the date of commit. Here, if we check the commits, we can see who has committed and made a change. In our case, we have made a commit from the users Prithvi Tech Developers. Now let us check the username and email used to commit from the local repository using the command git config -- global user.name. And the email using user.email. But we can also make a commit from different user name and email. In order to imitate this process, I will change the username and email ID of the local repository to a new one. Let us use the username as Tech Developers. And then the email ID as prithvi.eee2017@gmail.com. Now let us make some changes to our project at this new timeline. Means after changing the username and email. Here I am going to change the file example1 with a print statement. Added this line of code from Tech Developers from Git terminal. Now let us check the status. Now let us add and commit simultaneously using the command git commit -am and then the commit message. Commit from new author Tech Developers. Now if we push our local repository to our remote repository using the command git push origin main. Now if we check our remote repository by refreshing it, we can see totally we have 4 commits. Let us click on the commits. Here we can see the commit made by the new author. Here Git automatically recognizes the username set for the GitHub account and then uses that account to represent the commits. So in our case, I have created a GitHub account with the email ID prithvi.eee2017@gmail.com and give a name for the GitHub as Prithviraja786, and hence it is using that username to represent or to refer the commits made from that user email. So in our case, when we have used our email prithviraja.info@gmail.com, and while creating the GitHub account, we have used the username as Prithvi-Tech Developers. Hence, it is using this user name to refer the commits made from this email ID. If you use any unknown username and email ID, Git will not recognize until unless the email ID has been used to open a GitHub account. In other words, if the email ID is not added to any of the GitHub account to manage our personal or any other GitHub account, then it will be treated as an unknown email and the username will be used to recognize the newly made commits. Okay, but in our case, I have used both the emails to maintain the GitHub accounts. Hence, the GitHub is using those usernames which are associated with the GitHub accounts of the email IDs respectively. Now I would like to keep the username and email ID of the repository back to the previous status. Means username as Prithviraja and email ID as prithviraja.info@gmail.com. Let us change back Git terminal. And the email as prithviraja.info@gmail.com. So let us check the email ID and the username. Okay, now we have set our username and email to our previous state, and we are ready to go further. So this is how we can push our local repository to the remote repository and also make a commit from different username and email. Remember here that we have made a commit from different user, not from the different branch. So don't get confused with the words new author and new branch. While doing a commit from different branch, we can also change the user name and email. We will see that later in this course. But for now, just remember that the user is different from the branch. So now it is our time to see how to make a commit in GitHub. And for that, let us meet in the next lesson.